Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
This guy always makes us think, presents these situations, and a lot of them have morality attached, ethics. Well, of course, because he is somebody who has studied and dealt with and taught business ethics for years as a adjunct professor of business ethics, senior researcher, and so much more. And he's also our Diamond of the Decade here. And he's back with us. Ronald Berenbeim joins us on the program. Welcome back, Ronald.
We've talked about ethical duties and ethical principles, but I want to broaden the conversation a bit, the question to whom they are owed and for what. And there is, so we'll have our usual frame, the Kohlberg frame, which starts on the left for all intents and purposes with Benthamite utilitarianism, and on the far left, ethical egoism. And Bentham was the greatest good for the greatest number. And sometimes the greatest number is just me. That's all the way on the left. And that's known as ethical egoism. Then we move on a continuum to ethical principles and mandates. And they can be legal or they can be even biblical. If you are the Speaker of the House, but they have to be resolved sometimes because they conflict. And so that's basically its origin is Kantian and the universal law, universal principles that apply at all times, or should apply at all times in this situation. Then we deal with the issue, the sub-issue of the question to whom the duty is owed and under what circumstances. There's three levels in the development of these principles. At the top level is no conventional principles, in which case it's law of jungle. Basically, you decide based on your own instincts. And that's one side. That's the ethical egoism side. And on the other side, there may be some principles, there may be some laws or whatever, but basically, innately, you have to judge. You want to be ethical, at least. You don't want to be totally self-interested, so you want to go through this in your own mind. Then the second tier is the pre-conventional, and that is where, you want to make a nice appearance, at least. You want to look like you're doing the right thing. You want to get the reputation for doing the right thing. So in that case, on the far left, again, we have the intuitive, and we move from the intuitive to the mandated. And then finally, on the third tier, we have a situation where the greatest good for the greatest number really needs to be shown. You feel obligated, either legally or morally, to develop a rationale for that. And the best recent example I have of this is the so-called supply side economics, where by lowering taxes, you can actually increase taxes. Now, the rationale for this was that the owner of the corporation or the business concern would reinvest the money they saved from taxes, and they would earn a far better return on it by investing in new products, and that would in turn develop jobs, or they would expand their operation, which would develop jobs, and the people they employed would pay income tax. That's an extremely debatable proposition, at least in the way it's worked out since the 40 years or so since the economist Arthur Laffer drew it on a napkin. And I don't know what he did with a napkin thereafter. It may be in the Smithsonian Institution, or maybe it wound up in the waste box of the coffee shop where he was.
But you're right, that one comes up all the time.
All the time, still does.
And why have we not had a definitive answer on that? What do you think?
Well, we have a definitive answer that it does not work in certain situations, because the company has simply used the money to pay its top executives higher and higher salaries. It's used the money to buy back its own stock, which has increased the value of the stock. And that has happened in, I dare say, probably more often than not, but I can't be certain of it. Now, when they reinvest in new products and services and hire new people, then it's possible, but it's kind of hard to do the math on that one. So that was the sort of pre-conventional, if you want to call it, in the Kohlberg's schema, morality. And on the right side were the ethical principles, and they were equally motivated by self-interest in their own way. Company develops a good reputation, and that enhances the sale of its products, and its people are honorable, and all in all, and so on and so on, and that it can only redound to the benefit of the company. So then we get to the third, where the conventions are well established. Supply side still has its defenders as the greatest good for the greatest number. And on the right side, we have two different things. The universal law. We have various conventions like the OECD and the UN Principles for Responsible Management Education, and a committee on which I have served as a co-facilitator, where these principles are enunciated, and large numbers of companies that operate on a global scale, because we're now talking globally in most cases, they feel it's beneficial to adhere to these principles and participate in their formulation. But the universal law is not a static proposition. People have to subscribe to it. People have to be seen as complying with it, and those who do not have to be seen as being punished in one way or another for not doing so. And that has happened, as we know. So anyway, and sometimes this is called the fiduciary relationship, this corner, which is based on law, and that is not just an ordinary commercial relationship. That is an obligation of trust, where loyalties cannot be seen, cannot conflict, and we don't even know what these conflicting loyalties may be. Into that, and to explain that, many law and ethics professors have used the following example. P, and the P stands for principal, the person in this case who owns a racehorse, and he hires A, that would be an agent, as a jockey to ride that horse for him in a race. And during the course prior to that race, the A is approached by T, which stands for third party. And the third party said, I've seen you in the paddock. I've seen you run that horse in practice. I bet a huge amount on that, and I will give you $5,000 if you win the race. And so A says, fine. A runs the race and wins it, but he never tells P about the second arrangement. By the way, I think I forgot to mention that P is only paying him $500. So afterwards, everybody seems to be happy. P gets P's horse wins. A gets paid, not by one third party, but not by his principal, not just by his principal, but also by T. And so what could possibly be wrong with that? What is wrong with that is that P has that the agent A owes exclusive loyalty, exclusive, to P. Now, if he had asked P and P had said that's okay with me, fine. Why would P not have said that? And so we have multiple P's here, so to speak. Well, the reason why he would not have said that would be because if in the last lap, the agent, who is an experienced jockey, was maybe, a couple of legs behind the leader, and he knew that if he whipped the horse harder, he could probably win. But he also knew that there was an appreciable risk to doing so, that the horse could be seriously injured and never run again, and that or even that he might have to be, as they say euphemistically, destroyed. But anyway, if he saw that and thought he could do that and won, he still has been a disloyal agent because he owed exclusive loyalty to his principal. Had he consulted with his principal and the principal said, okay, that's fine with me, do whatever you can to win, then, of course, the interests of the two principals are aligned and the agent can proceed with a clear conscience.
So just to recap here for just a moment, Ronald, the jockey, his compensation here, I think you said it was $500.
Yes.
And the royalty portion of that, can we just clarify that? I want to make sure we have that clear.
Well, the third party has offered him $5,000 if the jockey wins the race, because the third party has bet a large amount on that horse.
And how does the jockey benefit from that?
He gets $5,000 from the third party.
Okay. But in the situation, he's made the determination to not push the horse for whatever reason, ethical reasons, humane reasons. He made that decision. Is that correct?
Well, I didn't say he made that decision. I said that's the decision he should have made, because an experienced jockey knows that it may not be it's up to the principal to decide what's his best interest. Maybe the principal figures out this horse, it's only got one win in it. Let him do everything he can to win, in which case the interests of the two parties are aligned. Or the principal could have a unique attachment to this horse and feel that he's just coming along. His best races are ahead of him, and he would rather lose this race and lived to play another day. So, but the agent doesn't know because he hasn't asked him and he hasn't asked for his permission.
Wow. Challenging situation. And this is, we're using it in the jockey horse racing scenario, but these situations come up in business all the time, right?
Sure they do, yeah.
And you were that jockey, what would you do?
Well, I like to think what I would do is that I would do what my experience tells me to go and not to urge the horse, beyond what I've done so far and hope to win the race. But if I didn't, I would at least have the consolation, if you want to call it that, of knowing that I had done the right thing, so
Yeah.
to speak.
And in terms of the owner of the horse, what's their recourse on this? Because it's the jockey that made the decision in the heat of the moment, right?
Yes, well, the owner's remedies would be legal. First of all, he would get his $500 back for sure, and the jockey could be liable for the resulting damages if the horse could never run again, and the owner could demonstrate through various different evidentiary showings that the horse had a great future in front of him, but it was lost. Then the jockey would be liable for additional damages.
I want to go back to the plateaus, the three that you had mentioned earlier, and you mentioned intuition. And we didn't go into deeper depth on that, but when you say that, how do you mean that in relation to ethics and everything that we're talking about today?
Well, you certainly have kind of a Jiminy Cricket inside of you, and when confronted with these kinds of situations, where you have an initial response that tells you what the right thing to do is. Now, Jiminy Cricket wasn't always right, and neither will you be. But at least if you make an honest and sincere attempt to, as they say, go with your gut.
Yeah.
That is one way of looking at it. But chances are, if you go with your gut, it is much more likely that you will think that the greatest good is your greatest good, and not in the split second of time that you have to think about it, think about what the greatest good is to the rest of the world.
Yes.
A good example, an interesting example of that, at least to my way of thinking, though I don't know that people have looked at it in that way, is the popular new film Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer thought the greatest good was to win the war, which at the time he agreed to supervise the Los Alamos project. The United States was at war with Germany. Germany. Okay, so what happens? They finally have the test after Germany has surrendered, but Japan is still in the game. So the big question becomes whether or not to use it on Japan. And Oppenheimer becomes concerned, if we actually do use it, and this is against Japan, not Germany, just another country, not a really truly evil country, as Germany was and as Oppenheimer believed it to be, then there'll just be a proliferation. Everybody will. It was easy enough for us to develop a bomb, and every country in the world will have one, and we'll see explosions like this will finally wind up on page 32 of the newspaper. So he became against further development of the bomb once he saw what it could do, and when he saw that Germany was no longer in the war. And of course, he was ultimately, his security clearance was revoked, and he wound up with the unspeakable and disagreeable situation of being a professor at Princeton for the rest of his life. But some people have to make choices that involve greater sacrifices than that.
I want to go back just very briefly about what you said in terms of going with your gut, because you and I are on the same page by far with that. And it is, I believe we have intuition. We know the right answer. When we talk about ethics, we all know the right answer. Sometimes it gets clouded. Sometimes we're so busy that we can't listen to within, or sometimes the right answer just seems so easy that we look at it and say, it can't be, it can't be that easy. Let me look for something more challenging. But the one thing you did say that really stood out for me is that doing the right thing, and I always say do the right thing, but not just for yourself, for the greater good. It's one thing to say, well, I'm going to do the right thing. That's the right thing to do. It might not support others. So it's kind of a balance there. But maybe this is what where ethics comes in terms of ourselves looking for the right answer and doing the right thing.
Another thing to say, I think, at this point, and I agree with everything you said, is the greater good is not the greatest good. There is no such thing. Whatever choice Oppenheimer makes, whatever choice any of us are confronted with, the issue is not going to permanently solve the problem for all time and for every situation. So you have to ask not just only what is the greater good, but which of these is going to make the world a better place, even if it's only slightly better. And I guess you have to give American policymakers, whether they proceeded it out of ignorance or knowledge, when they decided whether or not to drop the 2 bombs on Japan, or whether it was just a lucky outcome, that the greater good in a way was served by it, because people became aware of what kind of harm it did. So while they developed these weapons in vastly greater power and range than the original one, they nonetheless used them as deterrents. And those deterrents were successful have been for, almost 70 years in their ever being used.
Well, there's one thing that does underline all of this. There's always a choice. We all have choice in everything. What are you going to do in the next 5 seconds, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? We all have a choice. And I guess when it comes to ethics, or I know when it comes to ethics, we have to think about that choice, whether it is for the greater good. Fascinating looking at everything today and going deeper in terms of the situation and scenario. Ronald, how do we, if somebody wants to even talk a little bit more about everything today, how do we reach you? How do we connect?
Sure. It's Ronald dot Berenbeim, that's BERENBEIM at gmail.com.
Got it. I'm going to throw out there too, for the future, if you have a comment or even a question, or even a scenario that you'd like Ronald to address, you can always reach us at instantfeedbacksteve@gmail.com, and we'll get that done. Ronald, thank you so much for being with us again today.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
You too. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.